Little Fires Everywhere, by Celeste Ng. Part 8. Mia was right. By the time the custody hearing began, there had been a series of news stories, in print and on television, on Bibi Chow and her fitness to be a mother. Some of them portrayed her as a hard-working immigrant, who had come in search of opportunity and had been overcome, temporarily, her supporters insisted, by the obstacles and the odds. Others were less kind. She was unstable, unreliable, an example of the worst kind of mother. The last week of March, as the hearing began, the steps to the courthouse were crowded with journalists and tabloid reporters alike, all rabid for scraps of anything that emerged in the testimony. Because the hearing was kept private, like all proceedings in family court, the news stories could continue to be sensational and simplistic, easy arguments for one side or the other. Only those in the hearing room, the McCulloughs, their lawyer, Mr. Richardson, Ed Lim, Bibi, and the judge himself, heard about all that had happened, in all its messy complexity. And it was complicated. What had happened? It was a terribly awkward, agonizingly slow, painfully intimate story, that unfolded over the course of that week, back and forth between Mr. Richardson and Ed Lim. One of them making a point for his client, the other expertly picking it up and turning it neatly on its head. When the baby was found, she had been undernourished. Her fontanelle was sunken in, a telltale sign of dehydration, and her ribs and the small bones of her spine had been visible under her skin, like a string of beads. At 2 months old, she had weighed only 8 pounds. But the baby had refused to latch. Bibi had tried and tried until her nipples cracked and bled. She had cried, her breasts hard with milk. She could not feed her child, the infant screaming on her lap, furiously turning her little face away, and at the sound of the baby's cries, pink milk had gushed from her breasts and trickled down into her lap. After 2 weeks of this, Bibi's milk had dried up. She had spent her last $7 on formula and then her wallet was empty, except for a fake $1 million bill someone had given her at work, for good luck. Severe diaper rash on the baby indicated that she had sat in soiled diapers for hours, if not days, on end. But Bibi had no money for diapers. Remember that she had spent her last $7 on formula. She had done her best. She had taken the soiled diapers off, scraped them as clean as she could, refastened them around her daughter's waist. She had smeared Vaseline, the only thing she had, onto the angry red patches that blossomed on her daughter's buttocks. Neighbors had heard the baby squalling for hours on end. All day, all night, the neighbor from 3B had said. Screaming when I left for work in the morning. Screaming when I came home at night. He had thought about calling the police, but didn't want to interfere. I keep to my own business. But Bibi had cried too. Yes, she had lain and sobbed, sometimes with a baby across her chest, frantically stroking her back and hair, sometimes alone, on the floor beside the dresser drawer, she had used as a cradle, while the baby wailed alongside her, their voices floating to the roof in painful harmony. In her month and a half of turbulent motherhood, Bibi did not once seek help from a psychologist or a doctor. She should have, it is true. But she had no idea where to turn. Her English was middling at best. Her reading comprehension minimal. She did not know how to find the social workers who might have helped her. She did not even know they existed. She did not know how to file for welfare. She did not know that welfare was a possibility. When she looked down, she saw no safety net, only a forest of skyscrapers stabbing upward, like needles upon which she would be impaled. Could you blame her for tucking her daughter onto a safe ledge, while she herself plummeted? Bibi had left her baby early in the morning on January 5, 1997, at the fire station on Kinsman Road. That night the temperature had dipped to 31 degrees. With wind chill, it was 17. At 2:30 a.m., when the fireman opened the door and discovered the baby, lying in a cardboard box, it had just begun to snow, and everything was covered with a silvery, crystalline dusting. Although it had indeed been quite cold when Bibi placed her baby on the steps of the fire station, the baby had been wearing 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants, and had been swaddled in 4 blankets, every baby item Bibi had owned. Her little hands had been tucked inside to keep them warm, and a fold of blanket had been drawn over her head, to shield it from the wind. By everyone's best estimates, she had been outside for approximately 20 minutes, when the fire chief opened the door, and in the snow for perhaps 2. Only a little of the snow had begun to stick to the blankets, making her look as if she had been sugared, or dipped in diamonds. Bibi had been in the country only 2 years, by the time her baby was born, and in Cleveland for barely 1. She had held 3 apartments in the time she'd been in Cleveland, had broken the lease on one and had been chronically late and short on rent on another, and had never held a job that paid more than minimum wage. She had been embarrassed, every month, about being behind. 1 month she had paid in full and then hadn't had enough money for groceries and electricity. What a thing, to choose between hunger and darkness. After that, she had decided to pay what she could, and on days when she got good tips she would write her name on a piece of paper, fold a 20 inside, and slide it under her landlord's door. She kept track of the balance on an old envelope, that was always out on the kitchen counter. The balance ran like this: Sept $100 short 9/8, paid $20 9/13, paid $20 9/18, paid $20, oct $80 short so now $120 short 10/3, paid $20 10/14, paid $20 10/26, paid $20. Nov $70 short so now $130 short. Once she was behind, how could she catch up? And what other kind of job could she get, speaking little English, having not even the equivalent of a GED? During her pregnancy, and until shortly before she had left her baby, Bibi had worked at a restaurant, where one of the cooks had been arrested for dealing heroin. Prior to the time, several of the other staff members had suspected something between the two of them. There had been flirting. On at least one occasion, the cook in question had given Bibi a ride home at the end of the night. Was it not probable that Bibi, with such dubious associates, had also been involved in something illicit? The cook, Vinny, had indeed been dealing heroin. This cannot be denied. But his interest in Bibi had been purely platonic. He had pitied her, watching her belly swell, knowing that her rat of a boyfriend had taken off and left her high and dry. 10 months earlier, his sister had been in the same boat, and every night, when he came home to the apartment they shared with their mother, Teresa looked grayer, the baby squalling across her lap or slumped on her shoulder, like a little old man, the two of them there on the couch looking elderly and exhausted. Is it any wonder that every morning, when he saw Bibi, his heart would feel bruised? Was it wrong for him to joke with her, trying to make her smile, as he could no longer make his sister smile, to give her a ride home, when he saw her feet swelling, until the laces of her shoes nearly split? As for Bibi, she had found Vinny attractive, it is true. But her attraction came largely from his kindness to her, and the thought of a man, any man, touching her as the baby drummed her heels within filled her with repulsion. When Vinny was picked up by the cops, Bibi had felt a deep sadness for him, as if he had been a brother she would never see again. Bibi's current job as a waitress paid her the state minimum for tipped employees, $2.35 per hour. At 50 hours per week plus tips, her average take-home pay each month was $317.50. Could she reasonably hope to support a child, and provide all its necessities, on that income? Would she not be forced to seek welfare, and food stamps, and school lunches? Would she and her child not become a drain on the community's resources? But there would be love too, so much love. With that, you could get by with so little. It was enough for the basics: rent, food, clothes. How did you weigh a mother's love against the cost of raising a child? Mark and Linda McCullough, it was quite clear, had all the necessary resources for raising a child. Mr. McCullough had a steady, well-paying job. Mrs. McCullough had, for the past 14 months, been a full-time mother to the baby and planned to be so indefinitely. They owned their own home in a safe, affluent neighborhood. Overall they were in the 96th percentile financially. While in their care, the baby had been well-clothed, well-fed, and well-cared for. She had regular medical checkups, plenty of socialization, and plenty of enrichment, library story time, infant swim, Mommy and Me music classes. The McCullough home had been rigorously checked and certified as lead-free. Furthermore, the McCulloughs had shown themselves to be exceptionally devoted to raising a child. Records showed that they had tried to conceive children of their own for 10 years, and had been waiting to adopt for another 4. They had sought the advice of every medical expert in the greater Cleveland area, including the best fertility doctors at the Cleveland Clinic, and then engaged the most reputable adoption agency in the state. Did this not suggest that they would give the baby the most loving possible care, along with every opportunity? But the baby already had a mother, whose blood flowed in her veins, who had carried her in her womb for months, who had felt her kicking and flipping within, who had labored for 21 hours, as she made her way face up and screaming into the bright light of the delivery room, who had burst into ecstatic tears at hearing her child's voice for the first time, who had, even before the nurses had wiped the baby clean, even before they had cut the cord, touched every part of her child, her tiny flaring nostrils and the faint shadows of her eyebrows, and the womb-slicked soles of her feet, making certain she was wholly present, learning her by heart. Should custody be returned to Bibi, she would, of course, be raising her child as a single, working mother. Who would care for her child while she was at work? Would not the child be better off in a home with 2 parents, one of whom did not work and would be home raising her full-time, rather than in a daycare for the majority of the day? And would not the child be better off in a home with a mother and a father? Studies showing the importance of a strong male figure in a child's life. It came, over and over, down to this: what made someone a mother? Was it biology alone, or was it love? Back in the courtroom, Mr. Richardson was grateful that no one heard the last day, when Mrs. McCullough had been called to speak. She had come to the front. In family court, there was no witness box, just a chair, set to the side of the judge, and sat down, and he could see how nervous she was, by the way she crossed and uncrossed her ankles, by the way she could not decide where to place her hands, on the arms of the chair or in the soft hammock of her skirt. It had not struck him before that the witness box in court, for all its formality and imposingness, hid you from the waist down. That at least the world would not see your feet fidgeting, that as much as you might be judged, at least your legs would not. Ed Limp took his time in rising to question her. He was a tall man, especially for an Asian, 6 feet, lean and rangy, with the build of a basketball player, and indeed, he had played starting forward for Shaker's varsity team back in the 60s. He and Mrs. McCullough had been only 3 years apart at school, lifelong Shaker residents and graduates, and before this case he had remembered her only as a shy, slightly plump freshman with long golden brown hair. He'd been one of just 2 Asians in his class, The other had been Susie Chang. Kids had teased that they would grow up and marry each other. They hadn't, of course. Susie had gone off to Oregon right after graduation, but in the end Ed had indeed met and married a nice Chinese girl in college, a first-generation kid like him. Mrs. McCullough, however, remembered none of this, not even Susie Chang, who'd been a cheerleader for a year alongside her. "Now, Mrs. McCullough," Ed Lim said, setting his pen down at his table. "You've spent all your life here in Shaker, is that right?" Mrs. McCullough acknowledged that it was. "Shaker Heights High School, class of 1971. Did you go to Shaker schools all the way up?" "From kindergarten. Ed Boulevard, back when it was still K-8. And then the high school, of course." "And then you attended Ohio University?" "Yes. Class of 1975. And after that you moved back to Shaker Heights." "Directly?" "Yes, I'd been offered a job here, and my husband, my fiancé at the time, and I knew we wanted to raise a family here." She shot Mr. Richardson a quick glance at his table, and he gave her the merest nod. They'd talked about this in prep. The focus was to remind the judge, whenever possible, of how much she and Mr. McCullough wanted this baby, how family-focused they were, how devoted they were to little Mirabel. "So you've really lived in Ohio your entire life?" Ed Lim seated himself on the arm of his chair. Mei Ling's parents, as we all know by now, came from Guangdong. Or perhaps you know it as Canton? Have you ever been there? Mrs. McCullough shifted in her seat. "Of course we plan to take Mirabel there on a heritage trip. When she's a bit older." "Do you speak Cantonese?" Mrs. McCullough shook her head. "Mandarin? Shanghainese? Toisin? Any dialect of Chinese?" Mr. Richardson clicked his pen irritably. Ed Lim was just showing off now, he thought. "Have you studied Chinese culture at all?" Ed Lim asked. "Chinese history? Of course we're going to learn all about that," Mrs. McCullough said. "It's very important to us that Mirabel stay connected to her birth culture. But we think the most important thing is that she has a loving home, with two loving parents." She glanced at Mr. Richardson again, pleased that she had managed to work this in. "There are two of you," he had said. "That might be a big advantage over a single mother. You and Mr. McCullough are clearly very loving. I don't think anyone has any doubts about that." Ed Lim smiled at Mrs. McCullough, and Mr. Richardson stiffened in his seat. He knew enough about lawyers to know when they were about to snap the trap shut. "Now, what exactly will you do to keep Mei Ling connected to her birth culture, as you put it?" There was a long pause. "Maybe that's too big of a question. Let's back up. Mei Ling has been with you for 14 months now. What have you done, in the time she's been with you, to connect her to her Chinese culture?" "Well." Another pause, a very long one this time. Mr. Richardson willed Mrs. McCullough to say something, anything. "Pearl of the Orient is one of our very favorite restaurants. We try to take her there once a month. I think it's good for her to hear some Chinese, to get it into her ears. To grow up feeling this is natural. And of course I'm sure she'll love the food once she's older." Yawning silence in the courtroom. Mrs. McCullough felt the need to fill it. "Perhaps we could take a Chinese cooking class at the rec center and learn together. When she's older." Ed Lim said nothing, and Mrs. McCullough prattled nervously on. "We try to be very sensitive to these issues wherever we can." Inspiration arrived. Like for her first birthday, we wanted to get her a teddy bear. One she could keep as an heirloom. There was a brown bear, a polar bear, and a panda, and we thought about it and decided on the panda. We thought perhaps she'd feel more of a connection to it. "Does Mei Ling have any dolls?" Ed Lim asked. Of course. Too many. Mrs. McCullough giggled. She loves them. Just like every little girl. We buy her dolls, and my sisters buy her dolls, and our friends buy her dolls. She giggled again, and Mr. Richardson's jaw tensed. She must have a dozen or more. And what did they look like, these dolls? Ed Lim persisted. What did they look like? Mrs. McCullough's brow crinkled. They're dolls. Some are babies, and some are little girls. It was clear she didn't understand the question. Some of them take bottles, and some of them, you can change their dresses, and one of them closes her eyes when you lay her down, and most of them, you can style their hair. And what color hair do they have? Mrs. McCullough thought for a moment. Well, blonde, most of them. One has brown hair. Maybe two. How about the doll that closes her eyes? What color are her eyes? Blue. Mrs. McCullough crossed her legs, then uncrossed them again. But that doesn't mean anything. You look at the toy aisle, most dolls are blonde with blue eyes. I mean, that's just the default. The default, Ed Lim repeated, and Mrs. McCullough had the feeling of being caught out, though she wasn't sure why. It's not anything racist, she insisted. They just want to make a generic little girl. You know, one that will appeal to everyone. But it doesn't look like everyone, does it? It doesn't look like Mei Ling. Ed Lim stood up, suddenly towering over the courtroom. Does Mei Ling have any Asian dolls, that is, any dolls that look like her? No, but when she gets older, and she's ready, we can buy her a Chinese Barbie. Have you ever seen a Chinese Barbie? Ed Lim asked. Mrs. McCullough flushed. Well, I've never gone looking for one. Yet. But there must be one. There isn't one. Mattel doesn't make one. Ed Lim's daughter, Monique, was a junior now, but as she'd grown up, he and his wife had noticed with dismay that there were no dolls that looked like her. At 10, Monique had begun poring over a mail-ordered doll catalog as if it were a book, expensive dolls, with names and stories and historical outfits, absurdly detailed and even more absurdly expensive. Jenny Cohen has this one, she told them, her finger tracing the outline of a blonde doll, that did indeed resemble Jenny Cohen, sweet-faced with heavy bangs, slightly stocky. And they just made a new one with red hair. Her mom's getting it for her sister Sarah for Hanukkah. Sarah Cohen had flaming red hair, the color of a penny in the summer sun. But there was no doll with black hair, let alone a face that looked anything like Monique's. Ed Lim had gone to 4 different toy stores, searching for a Chinese doll. He would have bought it for his daughter, whatever the price, but no such thing existed. He'd gone so far as to write to Mattel, asking them if there was a Chinese Barbie doll, and they'd replied that yes, they offered Oriental Barbie and sent him a pamphlet. He had looked at that pamphlet for a long time, at the Barbie's strange mishmash of a costume, all red and gold satin and like nothing he'd ever seen on a Chinese or Japanese or Korean woman, at her waist-length black hair and slanted eyes. I am from Hong Kong, the pamphlet ran. It is in the Orient, or Far East. Throughout the Orient, people shop at outdoor marketplaces where goods such as fish, vegetables, silk, and spices are openly displayed. The year before, he and his wife and Monique had gone on a trip to Hong Kong, which struck him, mostly, as a pincushion of gleaming skyscrapers. In a giant, glassed-in shopping mall, he'd bought a dove gray cashmere sweater, that he wore under his suit jacket on chilly days. Come visit the Orient. I know you will find it exotic and interesting. In the end, he'd thrown the pamphlet away. He'd heard, from friends with younger children, that the expensive doll line now had one Asian doll for sale, and a few black ones too, but he'd never seen it. Monique was 17 now, and had long outgrown dolls. Now, back in the courtroom, Edlin paced a few steps. "How about books? What kind of books do you read with Mei Ling?" "Well," Mrs. McCullough began to think. "We read her a lot of classics. Goodnight Moon, of course. And Pat the Bunny, she loves that. Madeline. Eloise. Blueberries for Sal. I've saved all my favorites from when I was a child, and it's very special to get to share them with Mirabel. Do you have any books that feature Chinese characters?" Mrs. McCullough was ready for this one. "Yes, in fact, we do. We have The Five Chinese Brothers. It's a beautiful retelling of a famous Chinese folktale." "I know the book." Ed Lim smiled again, and Mr. Richardson's shoulders grew tight. Whenever Ed Lim smiled, he was learning. You had to watch out. You just can't tell what he's really thinking, Mr. Richardson thought, and then, instantly chagrined, what a terrible thing to think. He flushed. "What do those 5 Chinese brothers in the book look like?" Ed Lim was asking. They're drawings. They all look alike, I mean, a lot like each other. They're brothers, that's part of the story. No one can tell them apart." Mrs. McCullough fumbled. "They have pigtails, don't they? And little coolie hats? Slanty eyes?" Ed Lim didn't wait for Mrs. McCullough to respond. His daughter had seen this book in the school library in 2nd grade and returned home deeply troubled. "Daddy, do my eyes look like that?" "Not exactly, the image of Chinese people I'd want Mei Ling to have in 1998. What about you?" "It's a very old story," Mrs. McCullough insisted. "They're wearing traditional costume." "How about other books, Mrs. McCullough? Any other books with Chinese characters?" Mrs. McCullough bit her lip. "I haven't really looked for them," she admitted. "I hadn't thought about it." "I can save you some time," said Ed Lim. "There really aren't very many. So Mei Ling has no dolls that look like her, and no books with pictures of people that look like her." Ed Lim paced a few more steps. Nearly 2 decades later, others would raise this question, would talk about books as mirrors and windows, and Ed Lim, tired by then, would find himself as frustrated as he was grateful. "We've always known," he would think. "What took you so long?" Now, in the courtroom, Ed Lim stopped in front of Mrs. McCullough's chair. "You and your husband don't speak Chinese or know much about Chinese culture or history. You haven't, by your own testimony, even thought about that entire aspect of Mei Ling's identity. Isn't it fair to say that if Mei Ling stays with you and Mr. McCullough, she will effectively be divorced from her birth culture?" At this point, Mrs. McCullough burst into tears. In those early weeks she had fed Mirabel every 4 hours, held her every time she cried, and watched her grow until her heels stretched her newborn rompers, almost to the breaking point. It was she who had checked Mirabel's weight regularly, who steamed peas and sweet potatoes and fresh spinach and pureed them and fed them to Mirabel in doll-sized spoonfuls. When Mirabel spiked a fever, it was she who spread a cold washcloth on her forehead, who pressed her lips to that little brow to test the heat. And when an ear infection turned out to be the culprit, it was she who fed antibiotic syrup drop by drop into Mirabel's small pink mouth and let her lap it up like a kitten. She could not, she had thought as she bent to kiss the baby's flushed cheek, have loved this child more if it had come from her own flesh. All night, because feverish Mirabel would not sleep except in motion, she cradled Mirabel in her arms and paced the length of the room. By morning she had walked nearly 4 miles. It was she who, after breakfast, before bath time, and at bed, nuzzled Mirabel's soft belly until the baby gurgled with laughter. She was the one who had caught Mirabel in her arms, as she stumbled to stand upright. She was the one to whom Mirabel stretched out her own arms, when she was in pain, or afraid, or lonely. She would know Marable in pitch dark by one cry of her voice, no, one touch of her hand. No, one breath of her smell. It's not a requirement, she insisted now. It's not a requirement that we be experts in Chinese culture. The only requirement is that we love Marable. And we do. We want to give her a better life. She continued to cry, and the judge dismissed her. It's all right, Mr. Richardson said as she took her place beside him. You did just fine. Inside, however, even he was beginning to feel a faint tremor of doubt. Of course Marable would have a good life with Mark and Linda. There was no question about that. But would there be something missing from her life if she were to grow up with them? Mr. Richardson was suddenly keenly conscious of Marable, of the immense weight of the complicated world on this one tiny, vulnerable person. On the courthouse steps, when the reporters stopped them, he made a brief, anodyne statement about having faith in the process. I have complete confidence in Judge Rhinebeck, that he'll weigh all the issues and make a fair decision, he said. The McCullochs did not appear to notice this subtle shift in his tone. In earlier statements, he'd spoken with some force about how clear it was that they should receive custody, how obvious it was they would raise her best, how completely evident it was that Marable belonged with the McCullochs. She is a McCulloch, he'd insisted. Nor did the newspapers, which ran stories titled "Lawyer for Adoptive Parents Certain of Win." Mr. Richardson, however, was far less certain than the news stories made it sound. At dinner that evening, when Mrs. Richardson asked how the day's hearing had gone, he said little. Linda testified today, he said. Ed Lynn was pretty hard on her. It didn't look good. He meant for Mrs. McCulloch, but as the words left his mouth an idea occurred to him, a way to spin this, and later that evening he would call his contacts at the paper. The following morning, the Plain Dealer would publish a story mentioning Ed Lynn's aggressive tactics, how he had badgered poor Mrs. McCulloch to the point of tears. Men like him, the article would suggest, weren't supposed to lose their cool, though it was never specified whether like him meant lawyers or something else entirely. But the truth was, as Mr. Richardson recognized, that an angry Asian man didn't fit the public's expectations, and was therefore unnerving. Asian men could be socially inept and incompetent and ridiculous, like a long duck dong, or at best unthreatening and slightly buffoonish, like a Jackie Chan. They were not allowed to be angry and articulate and powerful. And possibly right, Mr. Richardson thought uneasily. Once the article came out, a number of people who had been neutral threw their support behind the McCullochs. Some who had been on Bibi's side found their passions cooling. For now, the idea is still forming in his mind, he said only, we'll see how things shake out. I feel bad for her, Lexi said suddenly from the far end of the table. Bibi, I mean. She must feel so awful. I'm sorry, said Izzy, is this the same Bibi that you referred to last month as a negligent mother? Lexi flushed. She should have taken better care of the baby, she admitted. But I dunno. I wonder if she just got in over her head. If she didn't know what she was getting into. And that's why pregnancy is not something to be taken lightly, Mrs. Richardson cut in. You hear me, Alexandra Grace? Isabel Marie? She lifted the dish of green beans and helped herself to an almond-sprinkled spoonful. Of course having a baby is difficult. It's life-changing. Clearly Bibi wasn't ready for it, practically or emotionally. And that might be the best argument for giving the baby to Linda and Mark. So one mistake, and that's it? Lexi said. I'm not ready to have a baby. But she hesitated. If I got pregnant, you'd make me give it up too? Lexi, that would never happen. We raised you to have more sense than that. Her mother set the dish back in the center of the table and speared a green bean with her fork. "Well, somebody's heart grew 3 sizes today," Izzy said to Lexi. "What's with you?" "Nothing," Lexi said. "I'm just saying. It's a complicated situation, that's all." She cleared her throat. Brian was saying that even his parents don't agree about it. Moody rolled his eyes. The case that tore families all over Cleveland apart. "John and Deborah are entitled to their own opinions," Mr. Richardson said. "As is everyone at this table." His gaze swept around the room. "Tripp, what's this I hear about a hat trick in yesterday's game?" After dinner, however, Mr. Richardson's thoughts were still clouded. "Do you think," he asked Mrs. Richardson as they cleared the table, "that Mark and Linda really know how to raise a Chinese child?" Mrs. Richardson stared at him. "It's just like raising any other child, I should think," she said stiffly, stacking the plates in the dishwasher. "Why on earth would it be any different?" Mr. Richardson scraped the remnants of egg noodles from the next plate into the disposal and handed it over. "Of course everything important is the same," he conceded. "But I mean, when that little girl gets older, she's going to have a lot of questions. About who she is, where she came from. She's going to want to know about her heritage. Will they be able to teach her that? There are resources out there." Mrs. Richardson waved a dismissive hand, inadvertently flicking a few drops of stroganoff onto the counter. "I don't see why they can't learn it alongside her. Wouldn't that bond them all closer, learning about Chinese culture together?" She had vivid childhood memories of Linda swaddling her Raggedy Ann in an old kerchief and gently putting it to bed. More than anyone, she knew how fiercely Linda McCullough had always wanted a baby, how deep that longing to be a mother, that magical, marvelous, terrifying role, ran in her friend. Mia, she thought, ought to understand that better than anyone. Hadn't she seen that on the Ryans? Hadn't she, maybe, even felt it herself? Hadn't that been why she'd run away with Pearl? She swabbed at the counter with her thumb, smudging the granite. "Honestly, I think this is a tremendous thing for Mirabel. She'll be raised in a home that truly doesn't see race. That doesn't care, not one infinitesimal bit, what she looks like. What could be better than that? Sometimes I think," she said fiercely, "that we'd all be better off that way. Maybe at birth everyone should be given to a family of another race to be raised. Maybe that would solve racism once and for all." She shut the dishwasher with a clang and left the room, the dishes inside still rattling in her wake. Mr. Richardson took a sponge and wiped the sticky counter clean. He should have known better than to bring it up, he realized. It was too personal for her. She couldn't see clearly. She was so close that she didn't even realize how unclearly she was seeing. For her it was simple: Bibi Chow had been a poor mother. Linda McCullough had been a good one. One had followed the rules, and one had not. But the problem with rules, he reflected, was that they implied a right way and a wrong way to do things. When, in fact, most of the time there were simply ways, none of them quite wrong or quite right, and nothing to tell you for sure which side of the line you stood on. He had always admired his wife's idealism, her belief that the world could be made better, could be made orderly, could perhaps even be made perfect. For the first time, he wondered if the same held true for him. It soon became clear, however, that Mr. Richardson was not the only conflicted party. The judge seemed to be waffling as well. A week passed after the hearing, then two, with no decision made. In mid-April, Lexi was due for a follow-up appointment at the clinic, and to both Pearl's and Mia's surprise, she asked Mia to accompany her. "You don't have to do anything," she promised Mia. "I'd just feel better if you were there." The earnestness in her voice was persuasive, and on the afternoon of the appointment, After 10th period, Lexi parked her Explorer outside the house on Winslow. Mia started up the Rabbit and Lexi climbed into the passenger seat and they drove away together, as if she really were Pearl, as if Mia really were her mother, taking her on this most intimate errand. In fact, since the visit to the clinic, Pearl had felt a strange sense of reversal, as if, while she and Lexi slept under the same roof, Lexi had somehow taken her place and she'd taken Lexi's and they had not quite disentangled. Lexi had gone home in a borrowed t-shirt, and Pearl, watching her walk out the door in her own clothing, had the eerie feeling of watching herself walk away. The next morning, she'd found Lexi's own shirt on her bed, laundered and carefully folded by Mia, presumably left there to be returned at school. Instead of tucking it into her bag, Pearl had put it on, and in this borrowed skin she'd felt prettier, wittier, had even been a bit sassy in English class, to the amusement of her classmates and her teacher alike. When the bell rang, a few kids had glanced back at her, impressed, as if they were noticing her for the first time. So this is what it's like to be Lexi, she'd thought. Lexi herself was back at school, wan and somewhat subdued and with dark rings under her eyes, but upright. "You stole my shirt, bitch," she said to Pearl. But affectionately, and then, "Looks good on you." Days later, shirt returned and her own retrieved, Pearl still felt Lexi's confidence fizzing in her veins. So now, when presented with a rare empty house, Pearl decided to take full advantage. She left a note in Tripp's locker. She told Moody that she'd promised to help her mother at home all afternoon. Mia, meanwhile, had told Izzy she had a shift at the restaurant. Go do something fun, she'd said. "I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" So no one was home when Tripp and Pearl arrived at the house on Winslow after school and went upstairs to Pearl's bedroom. It was the first time Tripp had been to her house, and to her it seemed momentous to be able to lie down with him, in a place of her own choosing, instead of on the old worn-out couch in Tim Michaels's basement, surrounded by the PlayStation and the air hockey table and Tim's old soccer trophies, all the paraphernalia of someone else's life. This would be in her own space, in her own bed, and that morning, as she'd made it carefully, she'd felt a warm glow at the base of her throat, thinking of Tripp's head lying on her pillow. Moody, left to his own devices, had just shut his locker and was headed home when he heard someone calling his name. It was Tim Michaels, gym bag slung over his shoulder. Tim was tall and tough and had never been very kind to Moody. Years ago, when Tim and Tripp had been closer and he'd come over to the Richardsons now and then to play video games, he'd nicknamed Moody Jake. "Jake, get me another Coke, Jake, move your big head, you're blocking my view." Moody had dared to think it was affectionate, but then he'd heard the word at school and understood what it meant in Shaker slang. Dave Matthews Band was dope. Bryan Adams was Jake. Getting to third base was dope. Being grounded was Jake. After that, he'd stayed upstairs when Tim came over, and was meanly glad when he and Tripp began to drift apart. Now here was Tim calling Moody's name, his real name, and jogging down the theater wing toward him. "Dude," Tim said when he'd caught up to Moody. "You know anything about this mystery girl of your brother's?" It took Moody a moment to parse this question. "Mystery girl? He's been bringing some girl over to my place in the afternoons, while I'm at practice. Won't tell me who she is." Tim shifted his gym bag to the other shoulder. "Tripp's not really a man of mystery, you know what I mean? I figure either it's someone totally sketch or he's really into her." Moody paused. Tim was an idiot, but he wasn't imaginative. He wasn't the kind to make things up. A suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. "You don't know anything about her?" he said. "Nothing. It's been, like, 2 months now. I'm almost tempted to go over there one afternoon and catch them in the act." He hasn't said anything to you?" "He never tells me anything," Moody said, and pushed the door open and went out onto the front lawn. He was still fretting when he got home and found Izzy reading on the couch. "What are you doing home so early?" he said. "Mia had her other job this afternoon," Izzy said. She turned the page. "Where is everyone? Is Pearl not with you?" Moody didn't answer. The suspicion was taking on an uncomfortable solid shape. "Some new project my mom's working on," Pearl had told him. "She just needs an extra set of hands." Yet there was Izzy, a perfectly good set of extra hands, at home, telling him Mia was out. Without answering Izzy, he dropped his book bag on the coffee table and headed to the garage for his bike. All the way to the duplex on Winslow, he told himself he was imagining things. That there was nothing going on here, that this was all a coincidence. But there, just as he'd expected, was Tripp's car, parked across the street from the house. He stayed there, staring at Pearl's window, for what felt like hours, trying not to think about what was happening inside, but unable to look away. It looked so innocent, that modest little brick house, with its clean white door, the peach tree in the front yard ruffled with soft pink blossoms. When Tripp and Pearl emerged, they were holding hands, but that wasn't what shook him. There was an ease between them that, Moody was sure, could only come from being intimately comfortable with another person's body. The way their shoulders jostled as they came down the walkway. The way Pearl leaned over to close the zip on Tripp's backpack, the way he leaned down to smooth a stray curl out of her face. Then both of them looked up and saw Moody, astride his bicycle on the sidewalk, and froze. Before either of them could respond, he jammed his foot onto the pedal and sped away. It never occurred to Moody to confront his brother. This was only what he expected from Tripp. All of his fury was saved for Pearl, and later that afternoon, when she tiptoed upstairs and rapped on his door, he was not in the mood to listen to her excuses. "It just happened," she said, once she'd shut the door. Moody knew from her voice that she was telling the truth, but it brought him little comfort. He rolled his eyes at how much she sounded like a character on a bad teen drama, and went back to tuning his guitar. "Whatever," he said. "I mean, if you want to screw my loser brother," Pearl flinched, and in spite of himself, he stopped. "You know he's just using you, right?" he said after a moment. "That's what he does. He's never serious about anyone. He gets bored and he moves on." Pearl maintained a defiant silence. This time, she was sure, was different. They were both right. Tripp got bored easily, and seldom thought about girls once they were out of his sight. But he had never encountered a girl like Pearl before, who wasn't embarrassed to be smart, who didn't quite fit into the orderly world of Shaker Heights, whether she knew it or not. Over the past 2 months, she had wormed into his mind at all hours of the day, in chemistry lab, during practice, at night when he normally would have fallen asleep quickly, and dreamed banal dreams. The girls he'd grown up with in Shaker, and the boys too, for that matter, seemed so purposeful. They were so ambitious. They were so confident. They were so certain about everything. They were, he thought, a little like his sisters, and his mother, so convinced there was a right and a wrong to everything, so positive that they knew one from the other. Pearl was smarter than any of them, and yet she seemed comfortable with everything she didn't know. She lingered comfortably in the gray spaces. She thought about big things, he discovered, and in those afternoons after they'd been together, big things were what they ended up talking about. How bad he felt that he and Moody didn't get along. "We're brothers," he said. "Aren't we supposed to be friends?" How he wasn't sure, at 17, what he wanted to do with his life, everyone was asking. He was supposed to be thinking about college, he was supposed to know by now, and he didn't, not at all. There's time, Pearl had reassured him, there's always more time. Being with Pearl made the world feel bigger, even as being with him made Pearl feel more grounded, less abstract, more real. "You're wrong about him," she said at last. "It's fine," Moody said. "I guess if you don't mind being the latest of his conquests. I just thought you had more respect for yourself than that." If he looked up, he knew, he would see the pain in Pearl's eyes, so he kept his eyes pointedly on the guitar in his lap. "I thought you were smarter than the sluts, who usually agree to do it with him." He thumbed one of the strings, nudged the tuning peg a little higher. "But I guess not. At least there's someone who wants me. At least I'm not going to spend high school as a frustrated virgin." Pearl fought the urge to cross the room and yank the guitar from Moody's hands and smash it against the desk. "And for your information, I'm not a conquest. You know what? I was the one who started it with him." Moody had never seen Pearl angry before, and to his embarrassment his first reaction was to burst into tears. He didn't know what exactly he wanted to say. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it," only the ever-deepening regret at how things were turning out between them, the desperate and impossible desire to go back to the way things had been. Instead he bit the inside of his cheek to keep from crying, until the sharp, salty taste of blood spread over his tongue. "Whatever," he said at last. "Just, do me a favor and let's not talk about it." "Okay?" As it turned out, this meant they stopped talking at all. The following morning, they walked separately to school for the first time, took seats on the opposite sides of the classroom in first period and every period after that. More than anything, Moody told himself, he was disappointed in Pearl. That after all, she'd been shallow enough to pick Tripp, of all people. He hadn't expected her to choose him, of course not. He, Moody, was not the kind of guy girls had crushes on. But Tripp, that was unforgivable. He felt as if he'd dived into a deep, clear lake and discovered it was a shallow, knee-deep pond. "What did you do?" "Well, you stood up. You rinsed your mud-caked knees and pulled your feet out of the muck. And you were more cautious after that. You knew, from then on, that the world was a smaller place than you'd expected." In the middle of algebra, when Pearl was in the bathroom and no one else was looking, he opened her book bag and pulled out the little black moleskine notebook he had given her all those months ago. As he'd suspected, the spine hadn't even been cracked. That evening, in the privacy of his room, he tore the pages out in handfuls, crushing them into wads and tossing them into the garbage can. When the can was heaped with crumpled paper, he dropped the leather cover, empty now, limp, like the husk stripped from an ear of corn, on top and kicked the can under his desk. She never even noticed that it was missing, and somehow this hurt him most of all. Lexi, meanwhile, was having romantic troubles of her own. Since coming home from the clinic, she'd been understandably skittish about sleeping with Brian again, and the strain was starting to show. She'd said nothing to him about the abortion, and it sat between them like a scrim, blurring everything. Brian's patience was increasingly wearing thin. "What's with you?" he grumbled one afternoon, when he'd leaned over to kiss Lexi and she had, once again, turned her face to offer her cheek instead. "You PMSing again?" Lexi flushed. "You guys. You think everything's about hormones. Hormones and periods. If men ever got periods, believe me, you'd all be in a ball on the ground from cramps. Look, if you're pissed at me, just tell me what it is you think I've done. I'm not a damn mind reader, Lex. I'm not going to apologize at random." "Who says I wanted an apology?" Lexi looked down at her hands, as if she might find a note scribbled on her palms, like a cheat sheet to guide her through. "Who says I'm even pissed at you? If you're not pissed, why are you acting like this?" I just want some space, that's all. You don't have to be pawing me all the time. Space. Brian slammed his hands against the steering wheel. For the past month I've given you nothing but space. You haven't even kissed me in like a week. How much more space do you need? Maybe all of it. The words fell out of Lexi's mouth like stones. I'm going off to Yale and you're heading to Princeton, maybe it's better this way. Stunned silence filled the car as Lexi and Brian both picked over what she'd said. That's what you want? Brian said at last. Okay. We're done, then. He clicked the unlock button on the car door. See you around. Lexi slung her book bag over her shoulder and stepped out of the car. They had been parked on a quiet side street, a spot they'd used often when they wanted time alone. He wouldn't just drive off, she thought to herself. This can't really be how it ends. But as soon as she slammed the door shut, Brian started the car with a growl and drove away. He didn't look back, though Lexi thought she saw his eyes flick to the rearview mirror, just once, before he turned the corner. Without thinking where she was going, she began to walk, down the sidewalk and around the corner and out to the main road, paths she'd driven often but seldom walked before. She and Brian had been friends since the 8th grade, had been dating for almost 2 years. She thought of everything they'd done together, screaming from way up in the bleachers at Indians games, watching from the middle school parking lot on the 4th of July as the city shot fireworks high into the night sky. Homecoming, Brian slipping a rose corsage onto her wrist, an Italian dinner at Giovanni's neither of them knew how to pronounce, dancing in the gym to the Fugees until they were both beaded with sweat, then pressed in his arms during, I don't want to miss a thing, so close that their sweat mingled. Now all that was gone. She walked and walked, following the curve of the road, stopping now and then only to let cars pass by, and then she found her feet had taken her somewhere she hadn't expected, but that felt like the only place in the world she wanted to be, not home, but the duplex on Winslow. Through the upstairs windows she could see Mia hard at work on something, and Lexi knew that Mia would know just the right thing to say, would give her the space to think this through, to process what had just happened, what would happen next, why she'd just left what she'd thought was a perfect boyfriend, a perfect relationship, how it had all suddenly fallen apart. When Lexi climbed the stairs and opened the door into the kitchen, Izzy was there too, sitting at the table beside Mia, folding scraps of paper into cranes. Handfuls of them in all sizes lay on the table already, scattered across it like confetti. She shot Lexi a hostile look, but before she could open her mouth, Mia cut her off. Lexi. I'm glad you came. She pulled out a chair and Lexi settled into it, her face so still that even Izzy could tell something was wrong. Lexi looked almost as if she were going to be physically ill. She had never seen her sister like this before. Are you okay? She asked. Fine, Lexi said through dry lips. I'm fine. You're fine, Mia said, squeezing Lexi's shoulder. You're going to be fine. She pulled an extra mug from the cupboard and put the kettle on. Without meeting Izzy's eyes, Lexi said, before you ask, Brian and I broke up. I'm sorry, Izzy said, and found that she really meant it. Brian had always been nice to her, letting her tag along for milkshakes once or twice at yours truly, when he and Lexi had first started dating and she'd still been in middle school. Giving her a ride home now and then when he'd passed her walking. She glanced at Lexi, then at Mia. Do you want me to leave? At the stove, Mia pretended to busy herself with opening a tea bag. Lexi shook her head. Stay, she said. It's fine. I'm fine. Just stay. After a moment, Izzy slid a square of paper across the table, and Lexi took it and began to follow her sister's lead, folding over, back, to the center, out, until at last she took hold of the corners and pulled, and a crane bloomed like a pale flower in her hands. Judge Rhinebeck says he's not yet ready to make a decision. Mr. Richardson told Mrs. Richardson the last week of April. Harold Rhinebeck was 69, gray-haired, a long-time boxing fan, an enthusiastic recreational hunter, but he was a sensitive man too, and well aware of the intricate emotional complexities of the case. Over the past month, since the hearing had ended, he had in fact spent nights lying awake for hours thinking about little Mei Ling, Mirabel, as he thought of her, trying to be scrupulously fair. Every time he heard one name he appended the other in his mind, and for him the two names had firmly blended into one. Because the baby herself was in the care of a sitter and not present, infants being notoriously indisposed to long hearings, Ed Lim had wisely blown up a photograph and placed it on his prep table, and everyone in the court had been staring at it every day. As a result, the judge pictured her small face as he mulled over each day's testimony, and the more he thought about it, the more undecidable the case became. He felt a sudden, intense sympathy for King Solomon, and each morning, short on sleep and uncomfortable in mind, he barked unfairly at his clerks and his secretary without even realizing why. "It's agony," Mrs. McCullough said to Mrs. Richardson over a commiserating cup of coffee. They were, as usual, in Mrs. McCullough's home, to avoid scrutiny. "What else does he want? How can this be a hard decision?" The baby monitor on the table beside them crackled, and she adjusted the volume slightly higher. Both women fell silent, and the quiet sound of Mirabel's sleeping breathing filled the kitchen. "Can you think of anything else you could tell the judge?" Mrs. Richardson asked. "Things that give more context. Other factors for him to weigh." She leaned forward. "Can you think of anything else you and Bill haven't brought up? Reasons you'd be the better choice for custody?" Or she hesitated, then plunged in anyway. "Or other reasons Bibi might be unfit? Anything at all?" Mrs. McCullough nibbled one fingernail. It had been her nervous habit as a child, and Mrs. Richardson noticed she'd been doing it again of late. "Well," she began, then stopped. "It's probably not true. This might be your last chance, Linda," Mrs. Richardson said gently. "Anything you've got, we'd better throw at them. It's only a suspicion. I don't have any proof." Mrs. McCullough sighed. "About 3 months ago, I noticed that Bibi seemed plumper. Her face got rounder and rounder. I noticed that particularly when she came with the social worker to pick up Mirabel. And her chest. And the social worker told me something strange. She said that on one of their visits around then, Bibi had to run off to the bathroom suddenly. They were at the library and she suddenly handed Adrienne the baby and dashed off. Adrienne said she heard Bibi throwing up." Mrs. McCullough looked up at Mrs. Richardson. "It just made me wonder if she might have been pregnant. She seems so incredibly exhausted and I just had this hunch. There's a look women get, you can see it, if you look. All these years, all this time we were trying, and one after another of my friends got pregnant, every time, I knew before they told me. I knew every time you were pregnant. Didn't I, Elena?" "You did," said Mrs. Richardson. "Every time, you knew. Before I'd said a word. And then, about a month ago, she suddenly went back to normal. Her face flattened out again. Back to being skinny and straight as a rail. I wondered." Mrs. McCullough took a deep breath. "I wondered if she might have been pregnant, and then ended it. An abortion." Mrs. Richardson settled back in her chair. "That's a big accusation." "I'm not accusing," Mrs. McCullough insisted. "I told you, I don't have proof. Only a suspicion. and you said anything. She sipped her coffee, which had gone cold. If she had an abortion, would that change anything? Maybe. Mrs. Richardson considered. Having an abortion doesn't make her a bad mother, of course. Though it would likely turn public opinion against her, if the news got out. People don't like to hear about abortions. And an abortion while trying to get back a baby you abandoned? She drummed her fingers on the table. At the very least, it would suggest that she was careless enough to get pregnant again. She took Mrs. McCullough's hand and squeezed it. I'll look into it. See if there's anything that might help. If there is, we can bring it up with the judge. Elena, Mrs. McCullough sighed. You always know what to do. What on earth would I do without you? Don't say anything to Bill or Mark, Mrs. Richardson said, gathering her purse. Let's not get their hopes up yet. Trust me. I'll take care of everything. Bibi had not, in fact, been pregnant. Under the stress of the impending hearing, with news crews filming outside the restaurant one day, and a journalist stopping her on the street to shove a microphone into her face, the next, with a story about the case out every other day, it felt like, and her boss grumbling about the time she'd have to take off for the hearing, she had given into junk food cravings, Oreos, French fries, once an entire bag of pork rinds, ballooning up 15 pounds in a month. She'd put in extra hours to make up for the time she'd be taking off, working until 2 or 3 on the nights she closed and arriving at 9 to open the next morning. That time, in her memory, existed only as a blur. And then she'd gotten food poisoning, a box of leftovers that had sat too long in the fridge, and thrown up right in the library, in front of the social worker. She hadn't been able to eat for days afterward, and when she recovered, she found that, with the hearing mere weeks away, she was too nervous to eat. By the time the hearing began, she had lost the extra 15 pounds plus 10 more. Mrs. Richardson, however, knew none of this. With no way to prove a negative, she began, logically enough, by searching for evidence of the positive. She could find anything out, she reminded herself. Even if she didn't know it herself, she had connections. The next morning, she pulled out her Rolodex and flipped to the M's, Manuel, Elizabeth. She and Elizabeth Manuel had been roommates freshman year in college, and though they'd found other roommates in later years, they'd stayed in touch, through graduation and afterward. They had reconnected when Elizabeth moved to Cleveland and became the head of a medical clinic just east of Shaker Heights, the only clinic on the east side, it happened, that provided abortions. It was a small thing Mrs. Richardson wanted to ask, a small, illicit, slightly illegal thing. Could she check the clinic's records and see if Bibi Chow's name appeared in the list of recent abortions? Unofficially. Off the record, Mrs. Richardson assured her friend, tucking the phone receiver against her shoulder and double-checking that her office door was shut. Elena, Elizabeth Manuel said, shutting her own office door. You know I can't do that. It doesn't have to be a big thing. No one needs to know. It's confidential. Do you know how much the fines are for that? Not to mention the ethics of it. Elizabeth Manuel had been friends with Mrs. Richardson for many years, and she owed Mrs. Richardson a great deal, though she herself hated to put it that way. She had shown up at Denison as Betsy, a painfully shy girl from Dayton, relieved to escape the constant teasing that had been her high school years, terrified that college might turn out to be the same. At 18, Elizabeth Manuel was an easy target for mockery, glasses perpetually sliding down her nose, forehead knobby with acne, clothes frumpy and ill-fitting. Her new roommate looked just like the snotty girls, who had made high school miserable, pretty, beautifully dressed, somehow at ease with the world, and that first night she had cried herself to sleep. but Elena had taken her under her wing and transformed her. She'd lent her lipstick and Noxima, taken her shopping, taught her new ways to style her hair. Walking to class with Elena, sitting beside her in the dining hall, Elizabeth had learned a new confidence as well. She began to speak as Elena did, as if she knew people wanted to hear her thoughts, and to hold herself taller, like a dancer. By the time they graduated, Elizabeth was a different person. Liz Manuel, who wore pantsuits and heels and architect's glasses, had made her look almost as smart as she was, a person who would go on to run a clinic with ease. In the years that followed, Elena, now Mrs. Richardson, had continued to offer her assistance. With her many local connections, she had put in a good word when Elizabeth had applied to the clinic, and after Elizabeth had gotten the job and moved to town, had introduced her to all sorts of people, both professionally and personally. In fact, Elizabeth had met her husband at a cocktail party the Richardsons had thrown some years before. He had been a colleague of Mr. Richardson's. Mrs. Richardson had never asked, or even hinted, at repayment, and both of them were keenly aware of this. "How was Derek, by the way?" Mrs. Richardson asked suddenly. "And Mackenzie?" "They're fine. Both of them. Derek's been working too hard, of course." "I can't believe Mackenzie is 10 already," Mrs. Richardson mused. "How is she fitting in at Laurel?" "She loves it. She seems so much more confident now. I think it makes a real difference, being at a girls' school, you know." Elizabeth Manuel paused. "Thanks again for putting a word in, Betsy. Don't be ridiculous." "It was my pleasure." Mrs. Richardson tapped her pen against her desktop. "What are friends for? You understand, Elena, I'd love to help you. It's just if anyone found out. Of course you can't show me anything." "Of course not. But I mean, if I were to come and take you for lunch, and I just happened to glance over your shoulder at the list for the past few months, no one could possibly say you had shown me on purpose, could they?" "And what if this woman's name is on there?" Elizabeth asked. "What good does it do? Bill can't use it in court. If it does, he'll look for other evidence. I know it's a huge favor, Betsy. He just needs to know if it's even worth digging. And if it's not, this goes no further." Elizabeth Manuel sighed. "All right," she said at last. "I'm tied up the next few days, but how about Thursday?" The two women scheduled a lunch date, and Mrs. Richardson hung up the phone. She would soon have this cleared up. Poor woman, she thought, thinking of Bibi with new generosity. If she had an abortion, who could blame her? In the middle of this custody case, with only a dead-end job, and after what she'd been through with the first. No one had an abortion without regret, she thought. Abortions were an action of last resort, when there was no better option. No, Mrs. Richardson could not blame Bibi, even as she still hoped the McCullochs kept the baby. But she can always have another, Mrs. Richardson thought, once she gets her life together, and she propped her office door open again.